he said, I've only asked you to do 3 things in the last 3 years, and this is one of them. So hello from Gary. You have a PowerPoint in your blue binders. It has a cover on it that says something like School System Flexibility in Charter Schools in Georgia, and it's 120 or so pages, and we're not going to do all 120 pages. We're going to jump around in the presentation, because what this is the presentation we use for orientation for state school board members, new state school board members, to help them understand charter schools in Georgia. And so for purposes today, we're only going to focus on 2 topics. One, the general area of flexibility in the law for charter schools and charter systems, and school systems that want another alternative. And then we're going to talk about recent changes in the emphasis on autonomy for conversion charter schools, of which you have several both up for renewal this year as well as potential applications. And so this is an area where DeKalb is stepping out ahead of everybody else in terms of taking seriously what the state board has said it wants to see, because it no longer wants charters in name only. It only wants you all to approve, and because it says it's only going to approve charter applications and charter contracts where the school is truly autonomous. You also have a charter cluster application. You're going to be first in the state on that coming your way over the next months, and they are working on the same kind of thinking. How do we make this cluster an autonomous cluster, part of the system, under control management of the system by law, but an autonomous cluster? And so we're going to talk about general context and then get into some specifics related to what's going on right here, right now. So first slide I'm going to talk about is slide number 2. And I don't know if I think I can, okay, good. And this is just kind of the vocabulary page before the chapter, because I'm going to talk about a couple of these things several times. So the first is improving academic student results. All the laws related to charter schools, charter system, i.e. squared, the June 30th deadline of 2015. Anything to do with any of this is based on improving the academic bottom line. And so you've got a financial bottom line. You just spent time on that, and that's part of the decision that you make when you make some of these big decisions. But the academic bottom line is one we put first, because that's the lens we look at everything through. Flexibility is a second term there, and that's our shorthand word for freedom granted from Georgia law. And you get the freedom through waivers. The state board has the right to waive almost any state law related to education, and that includes rules and guidelines. So normally I would have asked the superintendent to bring his copy of Title 20, which is this big, thick little, it's kind of like the Bible. He used it to keep his door open, I'm sure. But then for each page in there, there's rules of 5 or 10 pages. And then for each of the rules, there's guidelines from the State Department, another 15 or 20 pages. So you've got to stack this high of stuff you all have to do just to keep the state off your back. That's because we're on your back. That's because that's the wisdom and the logic of the law over all these years. It's a conglomeration for years. Flexibility and Title 20, the next one there, that's when we say Title 20, we're talking about that big stack. Flexibility says the state board can take that off your back, all but a couple of pages. That's in the state law. And so the General Assembly was told by school systems, if you get the state off our back, we can do better for kids. So they said, fine, here's several options to get the state off your back, and that's what we're going to talk about. Charter schools happen to be one of them, and they put that in the law a long time ago. The bottom, and the flexibility options are what we'll talk about very briefly, and then the bottom is the big 4. We mentioned that the way you get this flexibility from the law is through waivers by the state board. They can waive just about anything for anybody, and you all are kind of, you're one of the bigger districts that asks for very few waivers. And so one of the things that, you know, in this transition that you're going through, thinking about how can you ask for waivers that are going to help you is key, and going through this whole process of thinking about this flexibility is going to help you down that road. The big 4, while they may not be educationally something that you're going to want to say, this is a good way to help kids, they are ways that the General Assembly decided, since they couldn't give you more money in 2008 and they started putting these options in the law, they said, well, let's make the law such that you can save money. We can't give you any because there was a recession, but let's allow you to waive laws that cost you money. And so the big four are in that bottom box there, and you can tell just by looking at that all those will save you money. Again, they may not be wise educationally, and they may not be something you want to do, but the state board has granted a waiver on state class size for the last couple of years and for the next year. That's a grant that they can do, and they've done it statewide because of the recession. They're not likely to do it next year for 2014-15, so you need to start thinking now, if you're taking advantage of that, how are you going to make up for that? But these other ones, they're big money savers. I'm going to jump to slide 5. Please also stop me at any point because I need to try to keep this short enough. If you jump to page 5, you see the basic flexibility bargain. And it's a trade of all this autonomy, all this freedom we're talking about from the law for accountability. So anybody, whether it's a charter school or a school system, that signs up for one of these options, you get all this freedom. But the deal is you're saying, in exchange, we're going to raise student achievement. And so you're going to be held accountable in a performance contract for higher scores amongst your children. So that's the basic flexibility bargain. We used to call it the basic charter bargain, but it applies to IE squared and several of these others. Now we're going to jump to page 62, which is well back kind of in the middle of your presentation. And the first page says, where do charter systems fit in? And so this is where and I really don't want to spend a lot of time on this. I want to talk more about conversion charters and the charter clusters. Charter systems fit in because by June 30th of 2015, you're required by law, you, the local board, to choose a flexibility option or to pick status quo. So the third one on the list is status quo. The first two are IE squared, investing in educational excellence, or charter system. And those are the ones mentioned in the law. Status quo isn't really a flexibility option. It basically says, no, we're happy the way we are. We don't want any of this trouble. We don't want any waivers. We don't need any waivers. We're going to live without waivers. We're not going to commit to anything better. And they named it something people wouldn't like, and they made you have to have 2 public hearings to basically prove to your people why you're going to do nothing. And because the General Assembly is kind of pushing you away from that option. But it's an option. At the bottom, there's actually 3, not 2. Strategic school system, which I'll talk very briefly about. System of charter schools, which is probably untenable for a district your size. Smaller districts are looking at that 1, 4, 6, 8 schools in their entire system. System of charter clusters. Nobody's done that because nobody's even done a charter cluster. You're in a lead there with having one in your pipeline. But system of charter clusters is another way to get there. Not that you could get there by 2015, but what matters is that you're moving in that direction by 2015. You have to, because you're going to lose all your waivers on July 1st, 2015, you need to have figured out what you're going to do. We need to be well down that road. The next couple slides, very briefly, I'm not going to read them to you, but they do talk briefly about what each of these is, and I'll talk very quickly about each. So IE squared is on page 63. I'm sorry, we were going to go 62 to several of them. So 63, it's a performance contract. GOSA, the Governor's Office of Student Achievement, gets involved in negotiating your targets. You have targets for everything and everybody. So it's far more detailed targets than you would under charter system, for example. But you get the flexibility to innovate. You get the big 4 waivers if you want them. What the disadvantage is and why there's only 3 of these and 19 charter systems with 40 more charter systems in the pipeline for this year coming up, and nobody in the pipeline on IE squared, is that disadvantage, that third one. You lose governance over any school that fails to meet its targets. So you agree in advance what your poison pill is because you have 3 choices. 1, it could be a charter school run by a private company or a nonprofit out of your control. It could be run by the school district next door. You have to pick that one and make a deal with them. Or it could be, there's a third category. You could just turn it into an independent charter school, kind of like a commissioned charter school. So that runs itself. So those are typically unacceptable options to folks. Yes, sir. Into the future, because you have a 5-year performance contract here, and so the penalty isn't imposed till the 5th year, And so the question is, at the 5th year, are you looking for renewal of this performance contract, in which case they'd be out of it for those 5 years? Or if not, what else are you going to do that's going to help you keep your waivers? But in either case, they'd be out for the next term, whatever you did next. Yeah, the law doesn't go beyond that. So IE squared, very unpopular, no interest at all out in the field, but Gwinnett is a big district that's making it work. Forsyth is the next biggest making it work, and Rabun is a tiny little one making it work. So Rabun just got into the mix last year. So those are the 3 IE squared. Next is charter system. Charter system, performance contract between you and the state board. You basically get all the flexibility that we've talked about. There's 2 other things.
I'm sorry.
Yes.
It would help me when you say we, if you would differentiate between those, the charter petitioners versus the Board of Education.
Okay.
Because it's kind of hard for me to follow you, in that regard.
Okay. Actually, so far, whenever I've referred to you, I am talking about you, the board, because in all these cases, you have to act corporately to choose one of these or to agree to some petitioner's application. In the case of the system level ones, it's just a 2-party contract between you and the state board. For the charter schools, when we start talking about conversions, for example, those are the 3-party, and that's where the petitioners come in. So far it's just you. So thank you. That's an important distinction.
Question, just
yes.
Procedural one, and it's hypothetical. Being a lawyer, you never answer those, of course. But if in 2015 DeKalb became a charter system, what would happen to the current charter schools?
They would each have a choice to be in or out of that charter system, and they would have to have a vote, and they'd have to certify it to you all, and you'd bring that as part of you'd bring it the application to the board to consider in the first place for charter system. Each of them, you'd bring as part of that application something official from each of them saying we're in or we're out. There's typically a list of who's in the application, so we know what we're talking about. For example, Fulton County has 100 and some schools, 110. They have 90 in their charter system, effective a year ago today, July 1st. Last year they became a charter system. So all of their charter schools but one stayed independent. One went into the charter system. Over the last year, starting today, in fact, 2 more. So a total of 3 are out of the charter system, out of their being individual charter schools and into being a charter system school. And for Fulton County, what's interesting is they're lagging you in terms of freedom for their conversion charter schools. And that's why there's an incentive for a conversion charter school to become a charter system school, because they give them more autonomy as they're required to under the charter system law. So charter system schools, as you'll see on one of our next slides, are in fact charter schools under Georgia law. The only thing that they don't have that regular charter schools have is a 3-party contract. You, the board, have a 2-party with the state board if you're a charter system. If you've got these charter schools, they're 3-party, but if you're a charter system school, you don't have a 3-party contract. You're in the master contract in that list that we're talking about.
And this next question gives me a segue to recognize Ms. Mary Margaret Oliver, distinguished member of the Georgia General Assembly, longtime friend, cohort, new good old boy, and that's an inside joke. That's a title we both share, and that's a whole nother story, though. But so the way I understand, the legislature assumed that autonomy equated to improved academic achievement.
Correct. And in fact, there's
Is
some
there evidence to suggest that?
Yeah, starting in with the decentralization movement, frankly, it started with freedom schools in '63 was the beginning. It's one of the 3 strands that come together and form the charter school movement. So most people don't understand how there's a connection here, because education's been considered civil right from the beginning. We have decentralized schools in Chicago, Philadelphia, and New York that came out of that movement that pushed the whole system to decentralize. There's a lot of research done in the 80s, and then again a second wave in the 90s because I was helping run Cleveland schools. We were decentralizing there, and then I went to D.C. and we decentralized. The research shows if you give the people in the building control over people, time, and money, because they're closest to the kids and they know what is needed, if they're well-trained and ready and prepared, and you give them control over people, time, and money, and I'll describe those in a little bit here, then they are going to make the best decisions locally, and they're going to get improved academic results. If you do it wrong, like Chicago did the first time I tried it, it's not going to help. But if you do it right, it can help. And so that's where, in part, the charter school movement came from, that decentralization movement that basically said the schools are not doing what we need them to do. We need to have our own schools to do what we need to do. And so parents drove it, and there's a bunch of slides in here. Parents drove it because they didn't want their child hurt by the zip code. The community drove it because they wanted they wanted innovation. They wanted competition. The teachers, principals, drove it because central office, was in their way, and so this gave them the freedom to do what it was they wanted to do. That was the first generation of charter, and we're 4 generations beyond that now. So I'll stop because we could talk on this one all day. Yes, sir.
I won't belabor the point because I know we'll get to a lot of other information, but in kind of 60 seconds or so, I mean, the superintendent asked about whether it worked or not, and you mentioned that when done right, like Chicago did the second time, I think you said, rather than the first, that it works. What does that mean when done right? What are the key differentiators between right and wrong?
Similar to any curriculum you might look at and have looked at over the years, when implemented with fidelity, it will work because they're aligned to the standards, but it assumes that you've trained everybody properly, that you're going to fully utilize that resource. For a charter school, they've got freedom to make all these decisions, but if they're not taking advantage of that, then they're not going to get the results. So when done right means essentially with fidelity to the principles, in this case of chartering. By analogy, in the case of a curriculum, it's according to, because a curriculum, if it's spiral, there's scaffolding and there's an architecture to it. You have to do it in the order. You have to pace it properly. You have to essentially do what needs to be done, or it's not going to fly. Okay. So charter system, there's two things in the relative advantage disadvantage box. One is an advantage clearly, and that is that if appropriated, and it's been appropriated for 6 of the last 6 years, including when Fulton County came in last year, you get about $87 per pupil extra as part of QBE. So that's the supplement you get per pupil for being a charter system. Now that's capped at $4.2 million, and that's because Fulton County would have cost them $7 or $8 million, and they were only spending $2 or $3 million for the first 15 charter systems, so they put a cap on it of $4.2 million. Whether that cap will go up in the next session or not is a separate issue, but if you were going down that road, you'd have a material interest in that decision moving forward. The other piece that has to be mentioned up front is charter system. I said it's a lot like a charter school, each of your schools. And that's because you have to give them autonomy and hold them accountable, just like you do your charter schools. So you're pushing all sorts of autonomy out to the school level, and rather than a local school advisory council, you have a local governing team. They actually have to make decisions. Yes, sir.
Would you go into detail when you say autonomy, and would you give us some examples?
I will. Let me get through a couple more slides, and it'll be right in front of us.
Okay.
Thank you. That's where the rubber meets the road. Let me jump. The next page is 65 is strategic school system. It basically is an option we put on the table because the state superintendent said, why don't we just give everybody all this freedom if it's so great, and then take it away if they fail? And then our lawyers looked it up, and they said, because the law doesn't allow that. The law doesn't allow the state board to give you the big 4 waivers that are going to save you all the money unless you have a performance contract. So we said, fine, we'll come up with a performance contract here. It still doesn't allow it because it only allows it for charter system and for IE squared and for individual charter school contracts. So there's only 3 performance contracts where you get all the waivers possible: charter system, IE squared, or a charter school. So strategic doesn't yet have it. Now, there was a bill introduced. There's not a summary in here of this. There was a bill introduced past the House 174-1. Went to the Senate, sat on the Senate education table because Lindsey Tippins considered it premature because it was based on CCRPI, which just came out in test form, almost pilot year, and it's not real till this fall's numbers. Those are the first real ones that you can be held accountable for. That bill says, let's get rid of I-squared. Let's keep charter system the way it is. Let's add strategic school system, and let's give the state board the right to grant those Big Four waivers. That may or may not move next year, but come from the House 174-1, there's some momentum, but we'll see. So strategic right now is useless to you as far as saving any real money, but if it gets any of the Big Four in it, it might be useful. And what everybody asks me is, should we wait for it? And I say no. Make your decision irrespective of what might happen in the General Assembly next year, because that's a long path to go. And then if something good changes and you can use it later, change your mind, but get on the road in the meantime. System of charter schools is the next slide. I won't talk about it other than to say it doesn't make any sense for you all, because that's just too darn many charter schools. You'd have all these applications, three-party contracts. Become a charter system if you want to do this, because it's pretty much the same thing, except for all the three-party contracts. Status quo, we already kind of referred to it as being something that's intended for you not to want. You lose all your waiver authority, and since you don't use that much, that might not be seen as all that important, but you will be, as you continue to do what it is you're trying to do, you will be needing and using waivers. Let's jump to 69, a couple slides back, the little flow chart decision structure considerations. Basically, the first choice is, are waivers needed? And if you do need them, then you've got to do one of these options. If you don't need them, then status quo, easy, you're done. You've made your decision for June 30, 2015. Wouldn't go there. I would consider how you could use waivers to help the system before you went there. But once you do decide you need waivers, then the next big decision is, well, do we care about centralizing versus decentralizing? Do we want to put authority? Is it part of the way we think that we want to put authority out at the schools? Because if so, then charter system and system of charter schools are the two to consider, and it's really for you, charter system is the one that decentralizes. Now the other two, I squared and strategic, you could still decentralize while you're doing those, but you're not required to. So anyone on the bottom there, on the left three, you could do if you want to decentralize. For a charter system, you have to do it, though, and that's where the money is. And so that's why 40 school systems are looking at that this year for applications this year. We're going to jump back all the way to slide 16, which will sort of summarize a little bit about the charter system versus charter school stuff. Then we're going to talk very briefly about what the whole charter school thing is. So on page 16, it's a chart, what are the different types of charter schools, and we've been talking mostly about charter system, and it's the purple box on the right. It's the same starting point as a conversion charter. In other words, it's an existing school system, but it's a different endpoint. As I mentioned, it has everything but a three-party contract. That's the only difference between it and the conversion or startup charter. Conversion and startup, they start at different points, but they end up at the same place. Conversion is an existing school that gets a charter. You approve it, the state board approves it, it's a three-party contract. There's two kinds of startup charters. One that you've approved, that's the lower left, and then state charter schools. If you deny an application and they go to the new commission and get a charter, then that's a startup charter school sitting in your backyard that you don't have any control over. So I believe you've got one or two of those in the county somewhere, right? So, clearly for you in terms of, providing education to all your students, if you get these locally approved applications, giving them serious consideration is best for kids, because they're your kids. And if somebody else is running them, that might not be best from your point of view for them. Any questions on this slide here before I jump? Okay. So what makes a high-quality charter school? Slide 54. And I'm sorry for the jumping back and forth, but I wanted to give you the state board's thing. And when you go back to this later and look at it, it's going to make more sense in this order. So high-quality charter school on page 54, it's a big triangle, has four pieces. Strong academic results is the pinnacle. That's the point. No pun intended. Right below that is a well-trained and high-functioning governing board. That's the foundation upon which it happens. Now, that has to be balanced by those two on the left and the right, financial stability and legal and regulatory compliance. So those are the four things we look at when we look at an application. Do they have the capacity to do this? When we look at a renewal, did they do this? Yes, sir. Dr. Irwin? They could, not from us. You could offer it. Some districts do. The Georgia Charter School Association has some training. There's also, I think, probably 20 to 30 approved local governance training providers. The same list you all get that you have to look at for your training, charter schools can also use it. And at least half to two-thirds, they offer as an option charter school training. So,
how do you establish the baseline in terms of academic performance? Because it sounds as if a school that is already performing at a high level,
yes, sir.
What would be the incentive? What's the baseline to establish?
It's where they're at. We look at the previous couple of years, because if they're on a downward trend and they're doing charter as a way to save that school, that's a different story than if they're on an upward trend and they want to do charter to really bump it up. So it's kind of case specific, but it does take into account where they're at if they're an existing school. If they're a brand new startup, that's a whole different question. And we kind of use the baseline of the student attendance zone that they're proposing. So if they're a high-performing school, then you might say, well, how can they increase the number of meets or exceeds? Our focus would be on exceeds. If you've got 90% meets or exceeds, but only 15 exceeds, then we say, why don't you get from 15 to 40% exceeds, or 50% exceeds, or 60? So, again, case specific. I'm going to jump 2 pages to page 56 with a series of gears on it, and this is just a demonstration of the point connecting the flexibility, the innovation, and the performance. The big gear, the student performance one, that's the point. That's what we said on the very first line of the first slide. This is about academic performance. So the gear connecting to that is innovations. You're supposed to do something different that's going to lead to the increased student performance. And the gear that drives that one is the flexibility and the waivers. You need to get the state off your back so you can be innovative, so you can improve student performance. So what we ask petitioners, and what you do too as part of your process, is why do you need a charter? Why do you need freedom from the law? Because if you can't make the case that this freedom is going to help you improve student performance, then maybe you ought to be talking to the district about a different approach to getting done what you want to get done, rather than a charter. Because state board's not going to give you a charter if you don't need one. So we're happy to see that question added to your list. I'm going to jump right to your question, Dr. Johnson, which is on page 59. So when we're talking about autonomy, what are we talking about? We are basically saying wherever you are on the scale, and most schools are in the lower third to start with, we need to get you to the upper third by the end of your 5-year charter term. So we're not asking you to get all the way there. What we're asking you to do is make some serious progress to getting all the way there. So we want you far to the right. So the school level governing team in a charter school, or the school or governing board in a charter school, or governing team in a charter system school, they need to be able to make some personnel decisions, because if you can't control who's in your building, you can't control your outcomes. Make decisions about what happens in the school, whether it's curriculum, whether it's schedule, whether it's extended year, extended day, uniforms, whatever it is that's going to affect, when those children are in that building, those children, what's going to affect them, the folks in charge of that building need to have some authority over that, or how can you hold them accountable for the student outcomes? Student budget priorities, school budget priorities, you all say what the budget is. That's your business. You say, here's the per pupil amount every school gets, or here's what every school gets. They say, at the school level, all right, what's what we're going to do with that money you're giving us? We at the school have no control over how much you give us. That's your business, board. But we as a governing board, we get to say what the priorities will be about how it's spent. Because if we can't control our own budget, then how can you hold us accountable for the outcomes that we're achieving? Yes, sir. Right.
So should the charter specifically state that they're going to focus on underperforming students?
There's two parts to the accountability section of your charter contract. The first one is standard for everybody. It's based on the state accountability system, so that's CCRPI now, and every component of it. And it takes into account how you're doing with the low-performing kids in terms of the gains they're making. It takes into account everybody's score on math. It takes into account how you're getting them career ready. So that's up front. Everybody has to do that, and the only question is where are you now and where you going to be in the end of 5 years. So the second part could be you decide we're going to focus these 3 charter schools, big focus on the lowest performing kids, because that's what we're committed to, is fixing that issue. So then your whole plan is going to be based on that, and you're going to add extra measures to take that into account, because you're going to want to be held accountable you want us to reward you for the success you're going to have. It's also your way of keeping that school focused on that, if that's what they're going to tell you they're going to do. So the second half is more, what do you all want in it? The first half is what has to be in it. Yes, sir.
Turn your mic on. I guess it has to do with all 3 possible choices, i.e. charter, status quo. Based on the disadvantages that you've described, there seems to be, and I want you to help me with this, a presumption that charter schools are going to be more favorable than the other options. And should we deduce from that you have data that would support the performance comparison between IE square, charter, and traditional or status quo?
There's data in here in this presentation that we weren't going to cover that shows charters against non-charters, which would include IE square. Charters do better in all the categories except for math. They finally caught up with math, high school math this year. So in general, the data show that higher percentages of kids meet or exceed on each of the major tests, high school and elementary school, EOCT, CRCT, math, English language arts.
But you don't have the comparison between the 3.
We do not break out IE squared because there's so few of those. We typically don't. We do break out charter system, and they are traditionally the higher performers among everybody, including the non-charter system. But we don't break out IE squared. As to the kind of underlying...
I'm confused.
Yes,
Wasn't there a recent report that was covered very extensively in the local media that basically showed that charters, the outcomes are really not that significant or even different or less than other traditional schools, or did I not read it correctly?
That was the Credo Report out of Stanford, which we're one of 29 states, I think.
Right.
And that is that's a different kind of measure than if you just take what's the percent passing on CRCT math or CRCT.
What would that conclusion?
About the Credo Report?
Yes.
The Credo Report was a redo of a report done in 2009 with 16 states. This one has 29. So they redo the 16 and then they look at the 29. And what they show is from 2009, for the most part, using they tried to capture an overall measure. There isn't one. And they acknowledge, because we have to give approval before because it uses our data. So our basic complaint, and it's not really a complaint, our basic concern, which we say every time we give them permission to release a report, is it doesn't compare states on an even footing, because there isn't a single indicator for all states to use, which they acknowledge. And so that's why the results from that study are a little bit different. It's basically for most charters in most states, you can see some improvements between 2009 and 2012. For Georgia, it's fairly flat in most subject areas. Again, the way they're measuring it. And let me tell you a little story. Last year, we do an annual report every year. This year, and the results are here, you can see charters outperforming non-charters in everything except one category. And they caught up with them this year. If you look at last year's annual report, you see that charters were under the traditional schools in everything. And the reason why is because last year's report was based on AYP. It was the last report based on 2010-11 data, which was AYP. And AYP was a test of whether or not we all met a standard or not. And so the results show you didn't meet that standard, so it showed traditional schools above charters. When you just look at the data underlying AYP, who's doing better at meets or exceeds on math or ELA, EOCT or CRCT, charters are, except for the one. So depending on how you measure it, you get different results. We got a good example ourselves. Yes, sir.
On that Credo report, because they're not really able to aggregate the data across states because of different testing measures, what the report said is, at an individual state level, some states are doing better, some states are doing worse, and so that there was variability. So the headlines, because I read those, tried to sort of aggregate that information in a way that wasn't, I think, particularly effective, because they acknowledged in the report they can't really aggregate the data because the testing measures, and so you have to really go back to the state level data to figure out. In some states, the charters are absolutely falling behind traditional schools. In other states, they're exceeding the traditional schools, and then some are even, and then there's also the trend analysis in those schools. So.
And we as a state just changed how we measure things to CCRPI, which includes all these other pieces, and we haven't yet compared charters to non-charters. We'll do that in next year's annual report, and maybe do a preview in the next month or two for the state board. But again, it's how you measure it.
So, yeah.
But to your point,
Yeah.
your earlier point, you had an assumption that what they're telling you at the State House's charters are something that you ought to be really seriously considering.
Right.
I think that's true. I think that's part of, when you look at the growth of the charter school law in history, over the last decade and a half, from when it began, and I think it clearly is saying this is something we as a state have a commitment to.
Right, and I guess that's probably where the core of my question is. As I listened to the discussion with respect to the Credo study, there seems to be a concern on the part, at least of this group, that there are some concerns about the efficacy of acting on that particular study. But I'm also hearing you say that we don't really have any comparative study that tells us the incremental difference between the three scenarios that we have to choose from, and that's more efficacious. Help me understand this.
I think frankly, and let's just, because you've raised it, it's worth looking at one of these. If you go to page, 41. Page 41, we're looking at 5-year record of percent passing CRCT reading performance, charter versus non-charter. So you can see charter's been ahead the whole 5 years. Granted, and you look at the scale on the left, we're only talking about percent, but this is the population, so there's no sampling error, so there's no question that one's ahead of the other. If you look at the next page, you can see startup charter versus conversion charter versus charter system. And you can see the growth of charter systems to include the bigger districts in the latter years that are doing better. That's why that green line jumps ahead in 2012. So if you look at the next page, you see some bar chart on page 43 that shows you in terms of did not meet, the highest is the non-charter, which includes IE squared. For did not meet, for met, 55.7 is kind of second lowest, the yellow bar. And then for exceeds, the yellow bar is higher, except for startup charter. So you've got some mixed results if you unpack what those lines are telling you. But the average is the average, which puts the charters ahead and the big group, including I squared, behind. Now, Gwinnett does pretty darn good, but Gwinnett still has some issues. Forsyth does pretty darn good. In fact, there was a third category in that law that was passed 174-1 and then sat on the Senate education table. Third category is called high performing. And if your CCRPI scores are 90 or above for just about everybody, you automatically get all the waivers by doing nothing. So it's kind of like what the state soup asked us to do a couple years ago, but it does it in the law. So we've made a note here to break out the IE squared, because no one's ever asked us that in 3 years. Thank you.
But the legislature obviously made a decision without that. Yeah.
Well, they're planning to do, the bill does away with I squared, so everybody stop thinking about it, but we'll think about it.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So basically,
No, that's significant because the significant difference is a plus or minus based on sampling error. There's no sampling error in that table because that's the population. So they are ahead. And if you look at the other ones, they're ahead a little bit more. But you might say, so what? It's not significant difference doesn't matter because it's the population, but what's 1%? So look at, if you look at some of the other charts, it's probably 5%. If you look at page 47, the difference between non-charter and charter on ELA, EOCT, it's probably 5% difference there, charter ahead. So, but the bottom line point, I think, and I take it well, is there is, we're not talking night and day differences here. We're talking about we're all in the same ballpark. We're all dealing with the same students across the state, the same standards, the same tests, the same everything. We all get the same amount of money. So unless something's happening really innovative, and the only place you're going to see that is if you, and we've got some initial analysis and we'll be sharing it over the next couple of months. If you take CCRPI and you figure out what would you expect given the scenario you're dealing with at this school, what would you expect based on statistical analysis in terms of outcomes? We've got a whole bunch of schools that you would be surprised are doing far better than expected, and a whole bunch of schools that you would be surprised are doing far worse than expected. So for us, what matters is given, do a regression analysis based on what you have in terms of the student body that you have and the history of what you're going to have in terms of outcomes. And if you're doing significantly better, you've got DeKalb has one of the state charters, Kirkwood Ivy Prep for young men. They only got a 3-year charter from the commission because their results were lower than the girls' school that they have right next door. But the girls' school is doing worse than the boys' school in terms of given what you've got, what would you expect? And so that puts the boys' school ahead of the girls' school. And that analysis tells us it's kind of like, are you exceeding expectations or not? And that's where a real good comparison will be. We haven't done it for traditional schools yet. But the whole point of all of this is how you can help kids. And so if a school's doing something, and it's school by school, and I've started around, I worked for an EMO, and I started probably 30 charter schools and managed close to 80 in 8 states plus the District of Columbia. If you start it right, you start from scratch. It's not rocket science how to do good education. Go to any of your good schools. You'll find the same list of 15 things that's being done at any great school anywhere in the country and at a brand new charter school if you do it right. 5 years later, is it still going to be good? Depends. And that's the key. And that's why you all are here. Thank you for your commitment to shepherding that process through, because that's how it happens for traditional and non-traditional.
just one question.
Yep.
So is it the longevity of the charter school that they may start to deteriorate? Because I know when something starts, everybody has a bright light on them and everybody's putting in their best effort. So has that been looked at? The longevity of the charter with diminished?
Actually, there was an interesting study just came out recently that said if a charter school starts off strong, it's going to end strong. If it starts off weak, it's going to end weak. Right. But there's some in the middle, and actually my specialty was finding the charter schools that were weak and making them strong or closing them. And that's what we're doing here. So, all right, we're almost done. Sorry for, I like to talk about this stuff, and it's important, so. The most important stuff here starts at page 97, and we will go quickly through these slides. And you'll note they have a joint logo on them. It's us and you, because we're doing this in partnership. So right now, the next page, we've got. No, I've got a clicker here. We've got 5 conversion charters and 8 startup charters in DeKalb. They're listed there. And I'm going to move fairly. You see that list? Okay. Stop me if I'm going to try to move quickly through these. I'm going to call on Pat for help over here if I need it. So 13 startup letters of intent for the year that's coming up. So it's the 2013-14 cycle that you all consider and that we consider, and then they'd open in 2014-15. So 13. So here's a list of the names. You've got 3 startup charter review petitions under review. You have the next page, conversion high school cluster I mentioned earlier, Druid Hills. You can see the high school, the middle school, and the 5 feeder schools into that cluster. You can get a cluster charter, a single charter for the high school cluster. The high school gets the charter, everybody's up in part of it. So this is an important law that was created a few years ago, and there's plenty of room here for us discovering together how to make this work. And we've been trying to be supportive as possible, both your staff and the petitioner, moving through this process. The next page are conversion charter renewals, of which you have 3. 1 high school and 2 elementary schools. And again, I won't read you the list. You could see them yourself there. The next page is a startup charter renewal. Every 5 years, you got to go up for renewal. We've got International Community School that's planning to submit a renewal. The next page shows the deadline. So your startup charter apps were due May 16, 17. That deadline's passed. Your conversions are due August 15, 16, as are your renewals, and then your high school cluster at the same time frame. And these are tied to the state's deadlines, which are on the next page. You in general want to get us stuff by August 1st to guarantee we get it, the state board gets it done for next year. The conversions and renewals and charter systems are all November 1st. The next page, we've mentioned this, but the initial charter has to be a 5-year charter. And charter renewals can be anywhere from 5 to 10 years. So your initial charters that you'll have for conversion, cluster, or startup would be 5-year requests, and then your renewals could be anywhere from 5 to 10. And it's up to the applicant to request something. Now, sometimes we all work on this together. You all approve it. We look at it. We say, the school's doing so darn good. Why don't they ask us both for a 10-year charter renewal? Because we believe the state board would approve that. And then they could come to you and say, we'd like to make this 10. You've already approved a 5. Can you make it 10? If you say yes, then we'll take that to the state board. That's always a useful thing to do, because you're going to work on compliance, we're going to work on compliance, so it's not like we're sending them off into the wilderness and only going to look at them in 10 years. We're all looking at them every year. The next page, conversion charter schools. We've got 9 points that we wanted to make here. 1, it's got to meet all the requirements. That's kind of obvious. 2, we're now asking them together here to tell us about the autonomy that they're going to use, because theoretically, if they're a real charter school, not a charter school in name only, they're totally autonomous. I mean, they're still under your control and management, but you're giving them lots of autonomy. So this is the test to say, do you get this? Do you get, applicant, that you got all this freedom? Because you have to tell us how you're going to use it here. And so that's the key. That's the key part of that. So number 3 kind of unpacks that and says, we want to know how you're going to manage your financial resources, how you're going to do your HR. How are parents and community members and everybody else going to be involved in governing the school? What's that board look like? What innovative practices are you going to implement? So that's all part of the application. It also they also have to tell you and us, what are all the policies that we're going to have? Because the application process for you is, do we think this is going to work? For us, it's, does this group have the capacity to successfully open and sustain successfully a charter school over time? Number 5, for a conversion, they have to have secret ballots. They have to have the staff vote separately from the parents, and a majority of each need to approve it for a conversion charter school. So you have to have 2 majorities. So either parents or faculty staff could kill a conversion app. And if the faculty and staff aren't behind it, then you don't really want it to happen, because you got to have the faculty and staff on board to make it work. So a conversion application process involves getting everybody on board before you have the vote. Yes, sir.
In terms of looking at a cluster, naturally, you look at all the variables here that the board must consider. And in terms of, it's very difficult to get all the clusters together and all the staffs together. So what part does the board play in ensuring that all these variables are taken into account?
Your staff actually has the responsibility to bring you an application that takes all that into account, and they need to be able to show you. And typically, the applicants will have a table, or the staff will prepare a table that shows, here's the key criteria you all need to be focused on that match what the state's saying and the state board is saying, and here's how they did on them. So for a charter cluster vote, that's a different story. It's a majority of everybody. You don't separate the faculty and staff from the parents. It's a single vote, and I think August 13th is the date they plan to have that vote. But typically the applicant will invite the district to come and observe the vote, so there's no question that it was done properly. Sometimes they actually ask us to come. We typically don't need to do that if the district's going to be there, but that's a big one, and you're focused on the right thing. We got one more slide here. The last page with your logo and our logo on page 109, charter school petitions to local boards. Up until a couple of months ago, you had 60 days to do it, but now you have 90 days because you all told us we need 90 days to look at these applications. We can't get it done in 60 days fairly and go through a 2-month board review cycle. We need more time. So we asked the General Assembly, and they agreed to give you all 90 days from the date you get an application until the day you have to vote on it. And so your deadlines are based around your board schedule for August. That's why they're set in May. 90 days puts you in August right at that time, right at that limit. The applicant could grant you more than 90 days. You could ask it to grant it to you, but you don't have any authority, just the applicant does. They could say to you, if you could say, we'd really like to approve this, but we need another month to work on it, they could say, take the month. And we'd ask them to put that in writing and give us a copy so we know they granted you extra time. In general, you all like to get it all done at once because your staff are focused on it and you want it. But in some cases, if it takes another month to get an approval and it's going to be a good school, we're all in it together, so we work with you all. If you deny it, they can resubmit it by fixing it and then resubmit it. You can make them wait till next year to resubmit it. Some districts will let them resubmit it right away. It's really a policy question, whether there's a policy or not. Since you have deadlines for applications, you've got some flexibility, but it depends on how you want to play it. Different districts play it differently. And we will probably need to clarify that in the state board rule, which we're revising this summer, because it is played differently and it's led to litigation. And there's no good. It's been settled out of court in each case, but there's no good reason to go there. We'll try to clarify it. I don't know what the answer will be yet, though. And then if you approve it, your staff basically has a month to get it to us. So a lot of ground covered, and that's only about 30 of these 120 slides. The contact information is on the back. You're welcome to email or call, and we'll answer all your questions on this. I see two hands.
A question that I know will come up when you start dealing with clusters, attendance boundaries and boundary changes and this kind of thing. What part does that play in the board's decision and things that they must require in that regard?
The law is fairly clear about what is and isn't allowable, and the current planning of the cluster petitioners is that the zones all stay the same. Anybody who's in from out of district because of a choice that they made has the option of staying in by law. They're grandfathered in, and their siblings can also come in. But that cluster is the primary source, and there's only one lottery each year for those kids. Now, if that lottery doesn't fill up those schools, then they can take kids from anywhere in the district. And that's perfectly legitimate. We have charter schools like that all over the place, and that's what we'd expect to see in this application as well. So you just have to make sure they did that right. We'll be checking too. Good.
Dr. Marley, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Question is, when we're looking at the choices here, and we're going to be looking at accreditation, how does accreditation fit with the choices, whether it's system charter, individual charters? How does that all convene after those decisions have been made?
Well, it's an interesting question. One of the slides that I didn't talk about in here, because some local boards ask me, is if we do one of these, are we giving our authority, we the board, are we giving our authority away to these schools, to these charter schools or these charter system schools? The answer is no, but only under one condition, and that is if you're doing your job and the superintendent's doing his job. Because if you're doing your job and he's doing his job, then what you're agreeing to is give his authority away. Because he's sharing his authority with the schools when you have a charter school or a charter system school. He's saying, okay, you guys decide about people and time and money. I trust you to do that right. As long as you're not deciding if you're not in his business, then you have no problem. And when SACS looks at it, that's what they're looking at anyway for the governance piece. So it kind of proves that you're not in his business in a way.
Mr. Mayfield? Okay.
I have a word with Mr. Elgart.
Mr. Orson and Mr.
Mr. Erste, I guess one of the things that's going to be a challenge, because none of us have sat on this side of having to consider an application or a renewal, is sort of the expectations under the law about what we're evaluating, which is, are we primarily limited, as we would say as lawyers, to the four corners of the document that's presented to us, an analysis of the petition or the renewal petition and its validity and efficacy and our belief in its success? Or are there external factors that are also part of the evaluation?
Well, the triangle we looked at on page 54 with the four major components, that's what the state board's looking at. And the state board, there's 13 or 14 members now, depending on if the governor appoints the last one from the new district. They just need a certain number of votes to pass, whether it's approval or denial. So the answer to your question, not to be flippant, is it depends on what the state board says, because they're voting on it. You all approve at the local level, they actually grant the charter. So this triangle here tells you the answer to you need to be looking at all four of these things, because that's what they're looking at. If you focus on one, like you got a school with great academic results. The state board just terminated a school with the best academic results in the state amongst charter schools last May, a year ago, because they had issues with governance, they had issues with finances, and they had issues with compliance. So for them, that's big. That's big. So I would say focus on all three of these, because if you only focus on the four corners, this is three corners. Yeah.
No, I understand. So the criteria that we're applying to the document are basically these four factors, and our evaluation of these factors and whether the charter applicant and the application, in our belief, that they would meet these four factors at a high level of performance.
Correct. Yeah, and there's a couple pages after each of these that describes a little bit more detail what some of them are, and we've got plenty of additional information. And for us, we get an application from you that you've approved. For us, it's an iterative process. We'll work with your staff before it comes to you so that it's in fairly good shape. But if something comes up in the process, once you've approved it, we'll try to figure out a way that you don't have to re-vote on it by having them clarify what they meant, and it be in the record that they clarified it by saying this or that. Because our goal is to only approve good charters, but to have you only have to deal with it once.
Mr. Mayfield?
Yeah, I'll ask one last question. Do you have any experience or maybe knowledge of any systems that conversion systems that had to be unwound, and what that process looked like?
Over the last 3 years, I started at the department 3 years ago. We've had probably 8, maybe 10 conversion charter schools that are no longer charter schools. And in some cases, they looked at what we were asking them for and all this autonomy, and the school itself said, we don't want that. We got into this back in the day when we just, got a $500,000 grant and we didn't have to do a whole lot of anything. But now you want us to run the school? Forget it. So they don't even apply for renewal. The next group is, they're all gung-ho because they finally get the freedom that they want, and their local board or superintendent says, you want me to give them all this autonomy? Forget that. I'm not going to recommend approval, or if he does, or she, then the board says, no, we don't want to give that. Let's give that superintendent's power away. The third group is, the school's all excited, the board doesn't want it, but they approve it anyway because politically they can't deny it, and then the state board has to deny it. That's the smallest group, but that's a legitimate group, you know. So in all cases, it revolved around the autonomy. Because we're asking for a real charter school now, not a fake one.
Well, no, and maybe I should clarify my question. I was curious about what the
process
operational, what the operational consequences of unwinding a system.
In some of these schools that I just mentioned, where they're not using their waivers, they're not doing anything innovative, and they're not really all that different from the other schools in the system, doesn't take anything.
Okay.
We have one that today's their first day. They were a conversion charter, the first conversion charter in the state, 1999, I think. Today they're not a charter. Yesterday they were. But nothing changed at that school today. So for the most part, if you're a real charter and you're using your waivers and somehow you lose your charter, you can't do all that stuff anymore. So you either have to spend more money or you can't do innovative things that you could do before. But for the most part, none of the conversions that have changed were actually doing anything.
On behalf of the board, Mr. Erste, I would like to personally thank your department, you and your department, for coming and give us this valuable information. And Ms. Copeland, you have any comments that you would like to make? You're the local charter. I'm sorry. I didn't see. You don't have? Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, and we will be calling on you again.
All right.
And I hope you will be available at some point.
We're here for you. We put our phone numbers and email addresses on the last page, so.
Thank you.
We're serious.
Thank you so very much. We have the next item.